Uhuru. My name is JMHE, and I am your MC for tonight's political discussion. African Women Must Lead with Yejide Arunmila is a series of live monthly political education program from the African National Women's Organization led by President Yejide Arunmila. Tonight's topic is patriarchy, which will discuss Cheikh Anta Diop's two cradle theory explanation of patriarchy and the expansion of this archaic system among the colonized people of the world. There will be opportunities to raise issues pertaining this political education during the Q&A period, but please comment and engage throughout the program. African Women Must Lead is being multi-streamed live on Burning Spear TV and ANWO channels on YouTube, ANWO's Facebook page, and hopefully on our Instagram as well. Please take some time to like, share, and follow us on these platforms. ANWO is also on Instagram and Twitter for the folks who want to keep up with what we're doing between broadcasts. If you'd like to know the exact dates for future streams, make sure you follow us and check out our website for details. So, Uhuru, welcome, President Yejide. Oops.
Okay, here I am. Uhuru, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this African Women Must Lead first one of the year. I'm so excited to talk to you about this topic, patriarchy, and talk about Cheikh Anta Diop's two cradle theory as well, and the expansion of patriarchy as a colonial, as a part of the colonial mode of production. And so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're happy to get started. We just want to say also, if you were planning to watch us, if you're on another platform, you were planning to watch us on Facebook, we're having some problems connecting to Facebook. And hopefully you're able to go on over to our YouTube channels, Burning Spear TV and Uhuru on Facebook as well. So I'm sorry, on YouTube as well. So we'll fix these problems for the future. So comrades, thank you so much. I just want to get started. For those of you interested in, I really want to clarify too that, the reason why I find it so important to really highlight African men who tackle subject matter such as patriarchy, why I feel like that's so important is because I think it's really important because there is a common conception that men benefit from patriarchy, Black men benefit from patriarchy, and even perpetuate it. But I find it really enlightening and also refreshing to see that there are Black male African men who are digging into the subject matter and providing opportunities and evidence to say that this is not the way that African people were interacting with one another. This is not what we subscribe to, and that this patriarchal idea that is being prescribed to us as men is a colonial construct, and also the idea of patriarchy is a colonial construct. So we've in the past highlighted some works by Sankara, by Maloba, and today we're going to be highlighting Diop. And I also know that there are a ton of African women intellectuals too who dig deep around the question of patriarchy and provide analysis around this as well. And this is not to discount them, but I really want to hold up African men who dig deep into this process and attempt to understand the question of patriarchy from an African center perspective. So Cheikh Anta Diop, we're going to dig in tonight to Cheikh Anta Diop's two cradle theory, which is a theory that was published in his initial works in 1962 called the book, The Cultural Unity of Black Africa, The Domains of Patriarchy and Matriarchy in Classic Antiquity, where he talks primarily about the emergence of patriarchy in the world, how it developed in some places based on environmental or other factors, and it didn't develop in some places because of those same things. And I think it's really also important that, Cheikh Anta Diop was doing this from an anthropological perspective. He didn't just theorized these things and wrote a book. Like, he was a scientist and he did research and discovered, ways of living and concepts and traditions that can be traced to back up his analysis around patriarchy and matriarchy. So, but a little bit about Cheikh Anta Diop before we go into the two cradle theory is that he was a Senegalese historian, anthropologist, physicist, and politician who studied the human race's origin in pre-colonial Africa. He is considered to be one of the greatest African historians in the 20th century. He was born in Senegal, as I said before, but he spent a lot of time, he spent his studies, his university studies, he spent at the Sorbonne in France. And there he dug deep into his anthropological background, learned more about that. It's a research university, so he did a lot of research there. And he also met up with a lot of other Africans who were colonized by the French, and because they were colonized by the French, were considered colonial subjects, and that's why they were there in France in the 1950s. And so it was here in France where Africans were trying to solve problems related to the colonial situation, the direct colonial situation that they were experiencing on the continent of Africa. At this point, Africa had been colonized for centuries, and Africans who were now getting out of the continent and going to other places can see where the resources were going, and these African intellectuals at school with amongst the people who were benefiting from the theft and the robbery of Africa were now trying to figure out how to explain these concepts amongst African people, but also how to use what they were learning to help forward a new notion, which is the liberation and decolonialization of Africa itself. So in France is where Diop became so-called radicalized, and he also met other intellectuals too who were experiencing the same sort of desire to explain the world. So it was under these context that Cheikh Anta Diop began writing and began studying and looking at the origins of human race and human race origins and studying like anthropological studies. And this is also like really at a point where anthropology, which is a primarily white space, right? And they determine who is African, who was the first human, and all of these concepts that we are very familiar with and have to debunk all the time over and over and over again. Diop set about really focusing in on Kemet, or ancient Egypt, Nubia, and that whereabouts in Africa to determine like this is the highest civilization in Africa. And instead of Europe influencing how African people develop civilization, his arguments centered around that, it was Egypt that influenced or was influenced by the rest of Africa, and that the civilization didn't come out of Europe, that civilization was already in existence in Africa. And you can imagine from an anthropological standpoint in a very white space that this was contending with the precedents of white people and their thoughts and how they've dominated the space and told African people what they are, where we came from, and how they see us. So it was from this basis that Diop started to explore the origins of human race theory, and start to also explore the origins of human civilization, in particular how it relates to African people, and really busted open and created a whole bunch of discourse. So just to be quite clear, some people were with Diop, and some people was like, no, this is completely ridiculous. He's negating all of the Roman and the Greek influences in the world, and he's putting African in the center. And it was just like, yeah, he's going to do that because he's an African. And there are some people who also appreciated it because he does put African people in the center. he does what Chairman says we have to do, is that we have to make African people the subjects of history as opposed to the objects of history. And white people have long since been making us the objects of history. And Cheikh Anta Diop was making us the subjects of history and approaching anthropology from an African perspective, not only as somebody who is a scientist, but as somebody who has lived experience, who was entrenched in the traditions in Senegal, but it also is talking to other Africans too to find out what their traditions are, and examining the cultures of other peoples around the world that would fit into this two cradle theory concept. And it's there that Diop eventually came to the conclusion for the two cradle theory. And the two cradle theory basically says that one cradle, it was environmentally was more conducive for the perpetuation of patriarchy. And the other cradle, the southern cradle, was ideal for the perpetuation of patriarchy. And the reasons why he gives for the emergence of these two systems, and I would say too that this was not a widespread system. That these were areas of the world that conditions existed, and that relationships, family relationships, and social relationships, and all those things developed because of those environmental effects. So we're talking about the northern cradle, which is identified as Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, and then the southern, which is patriarchal, and then the southern cradle, which is Africa, south of the Sahara Desert, and includes Americas and the Caribbean as places where matriarchy developed. And there is also a zone of confluence, a zone where these two cradles meet, and therefore you see a lot more mixture of different kinds of societal relationships. So Diop said that the reason why the northern cradle would develop patriarchy is because of a couple of environmental factors, right? First of all, there's a scarcity. There's a scarcity of food, so that may it required that the people had to be nomadic. They had to hunt, forage, go out great distances. They did not have a sedentary lifestyle, so it was very brutal, very hard life that created this dependence and this relationship with men and women developing like patriarchy. And then it's often usually in colder climates that are very severe that patriarchy is developed. The terrain is difficult. It's usually rocky. Doesn't have a lot of arid. It doesn't have a lot of fertile soil or fertile basis for growing food, and you're highly nomadic. I find that there are some instances that negate that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But for the most part, I feel like it's true. And then there is the southern cradle, which has abundance, right? Like you have fertile soil, you have jungles, you have different types of ecosystems that, you can get food anywhere. You can grow food off a tree, you can dig into the soil, you got some food. So like that made it so that people did not have to go find food or had to hunt or go away for long periods of time. That created more of a social system. People were more close-knit, that women weren't reliant solely on men to go get food, but that women were also food creators through agriculture, and that required a sedentary lifestyle. And it had also a predictable climate. This also was some of the environmental reasons why matriarchy would exist. And let's talk about those two systems. So patriarchy is where men are the primary decision makers, right? They have dominion over the family, and the lineage in the society is determined by the father, right? And matriarchy is not like the opposite. I feel like matriarchy is something totally different from patriarchy. Like it's not where women are dominant over society. Matriarchy is where both men and women share power and make decisions about the community. That women hold a crucial position in the family and society as the carriers of traditions and the educators of the community. And I'm also reminded of like the stories of African women who were leaders of the Maroon communities in Caribbean and in the US, and even with Harriet Tubman, when African women are seen as like medicine women or spiritual women, that is revered and people hold that up. Whereas in Europe, if somebody is considered a spiritual woman, they're gonna get burnt by the priest and called a witch. You know what I mean? So like this is the two differences so far that I'm seeing. And then lineage may also be determined by the mother. So you may not know who the dad is, but you know who the mama is. And if children come out the mama, you know that that's your mama. And you know who her mama is. You know who that mama is. So lineage often is tracked through the mother. And in some matriarchal communities, there aren't last names or surnames. You just know who your mother is, your brother, your sister, etc. Now, as I said before, I did find that there were differences. For example, I would imagine that even though Asia is a part of the so-called Northern Cradle, um, that that within the line, the geographical line of where the Southern Cradle is India is right in there. And so I had to look. I was like, listen, like India is highly patriarchal. Like at what point in history and society that India becomes this patriarchal dominant society? We could see it today. It's very violent and abusive toward women across the board, and women are fighting every day just to get seen, heard, and respected, but also have power within that society and within that nation to do things. And then I found it. I was like, okay, some attacks from the patriarch. That's the zone of confluence there, right? Like that's the attacks from the patriarchal, was it Mughals that came in? They came from a Judeo-Christian background and started dominating India in the late 15, in the early 1500s. And then they were ruling India for 300-400 years until the British came. And, you know, we don't talk about the British colonialism, but then that like packed it in, you know, this whole question that raises up the significance of men. And then I also looked at very harsh climate. So I'm familiar with the Inuit, right? Like I was like, the Inuits are indigenous people who are have lived in some of the harshest climates on the face of the planet. Greenland, what is now called Greenland, what is now called Canada. And we look at, and it's a matriarchal society. There are gender roles. Men, they are very nomadic. Men have to go out and find and hunt for food for long periods of time. But what I also found is that the women are, although it's nomadic, the women are the ones who are staying back. And that creates the community, right? Like they may travel and the men have to go out for months, but the women are there taking care of the children, cultivating the food, sewing the clothes, building the igloos, all of those things that actually create the society. And then they also hold very significant positions within the family structure. They hold everything together. You know, men come back, they eat, you know, they eat, they get their clothes, and they make sure that the men are strong. Like if the men are weak, the men can't go out and get the meat, right? Like, you know, you can only get so many berries in the cold climate. But if the men are weak, then the men can't go out and hunt and bring back the big game. And they want to make sure that the men are taken care of when they come back. And so even within those gender roles that may seem patriarchal, but it's an equitable society. One can't survive without the other. And that's why it's a matriarchy as opposed to a patriarchy, which would be indicative of so-called a Northern Cradle. And I also think that it has to be more than just a factor of geography, that it has to be something more intrinsic, because where we see Diop's investigations really primarily focus between like the Egypt, Kemet region and Europe. And he talks about these other regions or these other areas in the world. He has examples of indigenous cultures in the so-called United States. He talks about indigenous cultures in the Caribbean, Africans, but he stays within that sweet spot of the Egypt, Nile area, Nile region, and then he goes to and he has this relationship between Europe. And so one of the things that I say too is that Europe, when people say that, when you had that sort of relationship between gazing in between Africa and Europe, there's definitely differences. Like you have this high civilization in Egypt, ancient Egypt, Kemet, and then you have like the savagery of Europe, the filth of Europe. In the times that we were developing, Africa was way advanced, way more advanced than Europe was in terms of social systems, family relationships, and so on and so forth. And so the behavior of women, the behavior of men and women, it was like every man for himself. It belittled and demeaned and diminished women in Europe, and women then became become the property of men, and you couldn't marry somebody without you couldn't be a woman without having a male over you, holding on to your property, distributing your property to you, even though it's yours. That could be a husband, brother, father, whatever. And I also would say that, one of the things that I find people say that prostitution is one of the oldest, uh, uh, what do you call it? Oldest jobs in the world. Like, that's one of the oldest things people done. And I was like, yeah, in Europe. And I would even offer in the northern region, in the northern cradle as well, because prostitution goes way back in Japan. I'm just saying that in patriarchal societies, prostitution is one of the things that emerges as a way for women to have agency in some cases, but also to survive, just to survive, because all of their wealth and all of their they have no way of surviving without the man. And then if they are choosing not to have a man, then they have to now use the resources that they have intrinsic to them, which is their body, to make money and survive. And so in patriarchal societies, you often see that the emergence of prostitution as well. In matriarchal societies, you don't really see that. So Diop was explaining this, and actually when we were creating the African National Women's Organization, one of the things I wrote a piece called "The Call to the African Internationalist Women's Conference," and this was the conference that laid the foundation for the African National Women's Organization. And in it, I wrote another sort of evidence-based discussion that Diop was having around some other attempt by a European to identify where matriarchy came from. And in it, I wrote, Johann Jacob Bachhofen's work, Mother Right, compiles documented examples of the role of women in the ancient world. In it, Bachhofen attempts to provide evidence of how all society transitioned from matrilineal to patrilineal system of inheritance through religious edicts, political declaration, and societal reconstruction, which essentially rendered women the property of men as a means to secure inheritance rights, which previously could only be determined through the mother. However, Cheikh Anta Diop, examining the work of Bachhofen and the cultural unity of Black Africa, determined that there is no definable evidence which supports the hypothesis of matriarchy as a phenomenon in Europe. In fact, Diop separates the world into two cradles of civilization, the northern cradle and the southern cradle, and provides evidence that refutes that the basis of Bachhofen's thesis that sexual promiscuity, which led to uncertainty about paternity, is what rendered a society matrilineal. Basically, Bachhofen was saying that because women were having sex with men and they don't know who the father is, what made a society matriarchal was the fact that you had a mom and you knew who your mama was, and that's what made it matriarchal. And Diop determined that the woman who enjoyed a sedentary life, typical of the Southern cradle, owes her rank and her esteem exclusively to the structure of society, which allows her to play a leading role, economic role, and not promiscuity. So it's not that you can, although your mother's line and your lineage is determined by your mom, that wasn't the only factor. The factor is that women actually did make decisions within the society, that women actually had played a crucial role in the food development and the holding together of tradition, which made them really important individuals in society. In some cases, women were the ones who named chiefs, head of tribes, and so on and so forth. And And one could not emerge as someone in power without the appointment by a mother or a queen mother or something like that. And so, but when Bachofen was looking at Bachofen, the white man in Europe who said that matriarchy developed in Europe, Diop was like, no, it didn't. There's no evidence of widespread matriarchy in Europe at all whatsoever. You can go to the tribes, the clans, or whomever. There's no evidence that women held a specific place in a role in society that was upheld by Europeans, and that through that you can see that as evidence. You know, we see the you see in the U.S. women were put on pyres and lit on fire because they were suspected of being other than themselves, like other than the traditional patriarchal role that they were set for them. There in Europe, their women were cast aside, called witches, also killed too. And the development of women as something other than to property of men caused great illusionment amongst white people, and they were killing white women left and right in Europe. And Diop was like, there's no evidence. There's no evidence whatsoever. There might be, right? Like, there's no evidence, right? But just say that in a small pocket of Europe, there might have been some woman or two women who experienced a life that wasn't oppressive, et cetera, and they didn't have to depend on everything from man. They was able to do and live and move around their society without men. Just say, for example, that was the case. That was the case, right? Like, there was no evidence of widespread matriarchy in Europe, and there was no evidence that there were multiple societies that were practicing matriarchy as a set. And again, matriarchy is not just saying that women control that society. Matriarchy is really an equitable society where men and women share decision-making powers, and that equitable relationship between men and women is about the forward motion of society, the progression of society. And patriarchy, on the opposite hand of that, is about the static motion of society, keeping these archaic traditional roles that serves nobody except for men, and keeping women back. And when you keep women back within the patriarchal society, you can't progress. You can't progress. I was also looking at how this. I was looking further at the Inuit, which I talked about a little bit earlier, about how they belong to the northern cradle, dealt with harsh conditions, but still were matriarchal. And as we move forward in history, we start to see that certain things like colonization, imperialism, and all of these things start to play a role in how people are connecting with one another. And one of the challenges that we see with the Inuit, as well as we see with other places around the world, is that as hunting and gathering weren't required because there were food stores that were coming in, modernization was happening. Men didn't need to go far off to get food. Women would now emerge, like they had already been the cultivators of that society, but they were also now going out into the workforce because men were traditionally depended on this act of going out, catching food, bringing it back, and that being the primary basis for their relationship to that society, now didn't have that because that was taken away through modernization and things that were able to move society forward. Now, here's the clash, right? Now you start to see, even though the Inuit are still matriarchal, right? There's still this high point for women in the Inuit culture to be matriarchs. There's still a contradiction that happens, because now these traditional roles that women were expected to do in a time when men had to go away and women had to stay back and take care of home, house, and things, are still things that they are expected to do, despite the fact that men aren't going out. And in some cases, they were saying that Inuit women were the ones who are the breadwinners. They were going out and making the money. Men were finding a hard time getting jobs, and they were coming home and they were still responsible for raising children and upholding the house. So this is where there might be a struggle or a contest. But because patriarchy overall has become a set system within society, the idea that women maintain gender roles as opposed to, like, the society has shifted, the needs have shifted, let's work together so that we can emerge and have a successful society. Instead, you're trapped by these roles and traditions that patriarchy says are necessary for men to feel powerful and women to not feel powerful. And so patriarchy does keep us in a place where we aren't able to move forward, and matriarchy does keep us make us move forward, as evidenced by all of the societies that actually practice matriarchy. And when I say practice, I don't mean that they intentionally do it, but that they actually emerge as matriarchal societies because that's exactly how they just interact with one another. So let's move forward. So Cheikh Anta Diop was talking about how Europe emerged as patriarchal and in the northern cradle, and then Africa emerged as matriarchal in the southern cradle, and then this zone of confluence where people interacted. There were attacks, there were invasions, all of the things that happens that will change the social system of a place, right? And so, we go into the enslavement of African people, which happened around the same time that the Mughals invaded India. We have Europe coming out of Europe, invading the world, imperialism, and bringing with it its backwards, archaic, oppressive, sick, depraved policies and attitudes of male superiority into the world. Now, because they've lived in these harsh conditions and they are savages, and they've had to survive their whole entire existence, one potato and bread at a meal, that they have coming out and they are savagely taking over the world with weapons of mass destruction, because they had to develop that, because based on their hunting and all the other things that they had to endure, they developed high weaponry, and they've developed a kill them, not me sort of attitude. And they've gone out into the world, and the people that aren't familiar with this sort of attitude and behaviors are now being attacked and taken over by the savagery of the northern cradle. And so, because of this savagery and because of this dominance that's emerging, you start to see that the patriarchy that may have the patriarchal society that existed in Europe is now being flooded down to the so-called southern cradle, right? And it's being reinforced because it's like these gender roles that people were involved with to forward society. Men did this, women did this. They did things together to make sure that the society had what it needed. Now they're saying that men has to do this, women have to do this. So in addition to, so men are now getting positions of power. They're becoming deputized by the colonizers. They're working in the office space. Women don't do men's roles. They don't do men's things. So women are relegated to the things that they've always done, which is agricultural work, child rearing, things like that. That doesn't involve major decision making for the whole entire society. And what colonialism was doing was setting up its state in these smaller colonies and using African men as their agents, right? And African women too. I'm not saying that African women were agents also, but primarily it was African men who was being taken in as agents. They were the ones who were administrating the government. They were ones who were in the police force, the armies, and they were being trained by the colonizer to do the colonizer's bidding. And women, and then families who were also used to working together are now being broken up because the way society was emerging to forward African people's needs were now being broke up to forward the Europeans' needs. So that would mean that we have a mine over here that has plenty of gold and diamonds and silver, and we need somebody to mine it. And the Europeans ain't gonna mine it. So what they're gonna do, they're gonna say, we need all these men who have good backs and strong knees, and they're gonna go over here and they're gonna dig out this mine. So we have men now who are being taken away from the development of their society, their home, etc., things that would bring them the things that they need and create a surplus so that women and families and people can actually deal with that in order to forward that society. Now they're digging out the minerals. They're in the homes of white people. They're digging out the minerals of white people so white people can take it away. And they're coming back to their communities broken, disillusioned, all of these things. Women who are now, and some of them are even running away. It's like, we ain't got time for this. You have policies that are being put down. You have to now pay taxes to white people who just came in here. It's like, now you owe us taxes for having your hut where it is. Like you heard of these hut taxes and things like that. So society was changing based on the needs of the colonizer and the oppressor, and that deepened the whatever sort of the male importance or male hierarchy in society. Women, just like in Europe, had been seen as diminutive and as people who only responsibility was to bear children and to ensure that the children were raised and things like that, and men didn't have to be involved in that for the most part. And for the most part, when you've colonizers come in, tell you what you need to do, and set these gender roles, women are still doing that. And because they have to pay these additional resources to the colonizer, are now also doing that, plus working for the colonizer. So that's why we talk about, like, people talk about a double oppression or a special oppression, because we're responsible to be held. We're held to these traditions within the home, even though society has changed, right? We're held to these traditions. And then we are also working on behalf of the colonizer, because we have to live in that society. So African women were working in the homes, colonized women were working in the homes as maids, as servants, and things like that for the bulk of that colonial experiences. Or they were, and on top of that, they had to make sure that they were growing the yams and the cassava in the fields so that they could have food on their plates in their homes. And they're responsible for that, in addition to child rearing, child birthing, all the things that you typically find that women are doing. So I think we see, like, with Cheikh Anta Diop's theory of the northern cradle and the environmental conditions, which I believe are some of the things that contribute to harsh realities and the origins of, like, race and things like that. Although there are some examples other than that, but we can clearly see that in Europe, which is the place that the colonization came out of, that we can see that those conditions in the northern cradle, which includes Europe, now have spread out across the world. Like, if the Inuit dominated the world, first of all, the Inuit wouldn't dominate. Like, I'm using them a lot. Like patriarchy also means that you have to go out and conquer nature. That's another thing. Like, patriarchy or the things about the northern cradle means that you have to go out and conquer nature. You have to be a master of nature. You have to tear it down, shut it up, and you have to control it. With matriarchy, you work with nature. Like, you use ice to make a house as opposed to chopping down every single tree in the forest to make a city. You know what I mean? Like, so these are the things that that matriarchy does. And because we're seeing that with the destruction of European people themselves, like, they were killing each other, and then they had these horrible sort of social relationships. They had slaves in Europe, the serfs and the peasants and all of that. All of that was their way of, like, really dealing with their own social connections and family things, and that really tore up the relationships. And so when they come to Africa and meet these people who are just like, here, have a coconut. They're like, what's a coconut? What's a grape? You know what I'm saying? What is these things? Orange? And all of rice, like, they all have potato, and they might have some bread, and they might have some mutton from time to time. And here we have people who are coming to them with, like, so many different kinds of things. And so we're dealing with these two environments, and we see that. And then colonialism does this, the part that maybe that just being in your cradle could not do, right? Like, now you're expanding throughout the world, you're conquering peoples, you're saying that this person has more power to do this than this person. How dare you send your wife, for example, how dare you send your wife to handle a business with a man, and that sort of shame too that comes along with being a male in a patriarchal society is like, if you come from a matriarchal society where women can go and do all the things that men can do, and you send the most revered leader in your community to go deal with the person that you want to make decisions with in the opposite community, and it happens to be a woman, you're shamed out of existence. And then it's like, okay, I can't send Queen Mother this time. I got to go send, Larry. to go deal with these oppressors, and so there's a shame that also comes with being dominated by patriarchal. And so I think that when we look at like patriarchy today, that we see that that shame is something that is being exerted over men. It's a burden. I would think that patriarchy is a burden for men as much as it is for women. Like they benefit from them, but it's a burden to have to always subscribe to these ideas of maleness and manhood that traps you into not, moving beyond this by keeping society in a certain kind of way, by trapping yourself and women into traditional roles. When you want to, maybe you want to love on the kids and you want to go cook and, these sort of things that trap and burden men with the responsibility of always having to be so-called men. And I don't mean that you're not a man if you're not a man. You know what I mean? I just mean that you just you're trapped by these gender norms and these gender realities that come as a consequence of being colonially dominated, and you have to let it go. We all have to let it go. Women also carry that. I also want to say that women also carry that. This idea with the example that I was sharing earlier about you want to make sure that the men are strong so that they can go out, hunt, food, gather, and that women usually did that. And so usually women were the ones who build up their men, make sure that they were good, and they were able to go out into the world and bring back the bacon. So that's where that comes from. Bring home the bacon and keep doing that. And so you had a role of supporter and of supporter of the family. And I think that that's good to a certain degree. But as society changes and all of the mode of production is changing and people are now shifting into different roles, I think both people need that emotional support that happens within matriarchy that promotes, like, we got to go out here and do this together because we got to do this thing together, and we got to get these kids together, and we got to get our house all of these things are like matriarchal stuff. I was reading a book. The book was called Nisa. This is back when I was pregnant, and I was just reading different kinds of books, and this book, Nisa, examined the Kung, and I'm saying it wrong because there's a clique in there because they're in Southern Africa, and I think they're pygmies, right? So-called pygmies, Bantu people. And, they're tiny people, very beady hair. And they were following the life of Nisa, right? And the Kung people. And basically what the anthropologist was saying was that in that society, that men would go away and they would go do what they got to do and hunt, gather, and things like that. And this is also a harsh environment. Like, this is in Africa, but it's also a harsh environment. It's very arid. It's a hunter-gatherer community, so that means you have to hunt for wild game. There's not very much fertile land. It's desert, bush here and there. And so men had to go on long trips to hunt. And that also was a testament of a manhood too. Like, you had to go through your rite of passage. You had to be sworn in as a warrior. Like, there's all kinds of things that happen in addition to women becoming women in that society as well. But it was in that society, what they were saying, this is like maybe a book that was written in the 80s. They were saying that, the society that women in that society had the agency to be sexually promiscuous. They could be with whomever they wanted to. If a man came back and their wife was pregnant, they was like, we got a baby coming. It wasn't like they was trying to find out who the daddy was. They're like, oh, more children, which means abundance in the community. I wasn't here, but somebody in this community did it. But this is going to be our children. You know what I mean? And that Nisa, who was somebody who had several husbands, so she could have a husband, don't like him, she'd toss him away, get another husband. She also had women partners. And so this society had a very fluid idea around gender, very fluid idea about sexuality and relationship, monogamy and polygamy, and what's the polyandry. And it was all about what was needed at the time. So that society, that community was shifting based on the needs of that community at any given moment. That's a matriarchal society, right? If you gotta have two husbands, you gotta have two husbands. You know what I'm saying? If you need two wives, you need two wives. If there ain't no men, you partner up with the women. If there ain't no women, you partner up with the men. These are the kinds of things that shift within that community that says that this is how we're going to do the thing. We're going to have to move forward. These relationships are going to help promote the community. And I'm mentioning that to say that we have these very often rigid ideas about what matriarchy and patriarchy is. I mean, obviously patriarchy is very rigid. Obviously patriarchy is very oppressive. But patriarchy isn't the thing, right? Like it isn't the thing that is the system that's going to, like, if we got rid of patriarchy, then we'd be free from everything. The fact is that for colonized people, patriarchy is just one subset of all the things that we have to contend with. And that patriarchy within the lives of African people as a general, everyday, traditional, archaic sort of thing that we have to experience is as a result of the colonial domination of our people, of our land, the taking of our resources. It's part and parcel of this whole capture of our power and usage of our power and labor for the benefit of white people, Europe, the oppressor nation. And so when people prioritize patriarchy, they see they are living in the here and now, and that's true. You should live in the here and now, right? But they also are not really understanding that the patriarchy for African people, based on Diop's theory, was not something that we experienced or even lived in, or even was even widespread throughout the continent of Africa. If you look at different pockets of Africa and how people were developing, it wasn't that. We were a matriarchal society for the most part, and there may have been patriarchal situations because, again, situations develop based on the environment that you're living in. So it may have been men have been more favored in one area than another. But for the most part, because of the environmental conditions of so-called sub-Saharan Africa, that matriarchy developed more often and then more widespread than patriarchy did. So when we examine all of these things, like Maloba in one of his books was saying how women had inheritance rights, they had access, they were owners of land, they were able to move, they had economic freedom, they could travel and go wherever and do whatever. They didn't need a man's permission to do that. They were bringing in money for the community, for themselves, resources, all of these things. And all of these things then became a shift for stopped, right? And then all of the economic conditions were then carried forward to white people and the oppressor once they attacked us, right? So everything now became circled around providing the lifestyle, the resources, all of things for white folks. And so that's why as African women, we approach this question of patriarchy from an anti-colonial perspective. Like, in order for us to really deal with the question of patriarchy, we have to be anti-colonialist. We have to be people who are working for the destruction of colonialism and tearing it down piece by piece. And as a part of that destruction, we're taking down all of the isms, right? Like racism, we're taking down patriarchy, taking down all of the isms that would keep us in an old, archaic, oppressive state. And we're moving forward out of that. We're shedding that through the anti-colonial or decolonial process. And patriarchy will get shed. Anybody who wants to, as we've seen in some of the other studies that I've given, and particularly the one where we talk about African women as freedom fighters, right? We talk about how like most national struggles for national liberation required women. They might have been lied to, say, oh, we're going to give you this, we're going to get, but women were needed in order to win these battles. So society, these national liberation struggles is just like, okay, any archaic ideas of maleness and womenness has to be dealt away with. That's why a lot of the national liberation struggles who actually wanted to win was dealing with the question of men and women and gender issues within the process of making the revolution, because it did not serve them to keep women out of this process of transforming society. And so any revolutionary, any progressive, anybody who wants to transform the world has to embrace a non-patriarchal idea. They have to be anti-colonial. They can't say, okay, I'm not a patriarchal. I don't believe in patriarchy, but I'm for colonialism. Those two cannot exist. You can't be anti-colonial and be like, yeah, but my wife got to be at home in the kitchen, making sure I got food on the table. You can't be somebody who's like that. If you actually want to transform society, women have to be a part of that process. And decision makers, people who are changing and transforming things, and doing all the things that are necessary for the forward motion, the shaping, the making of human history, and the shaping of human society. And you can't be trapped in the archaic, backwards notions of maleness and womanness and things that don't serve us. In examining Diop's northern, southern cradle and zone of confluence, we start to see how society, and I think he's like antiquity. I mean, he's talking about like the origins of human people and where they emerged and where pockets of people started to come up in great numbers and how they emerged in those types of societies. And then we shift, he's talking about ancient Egypt for that. We're not even in teens, we're in like the single digits. We're in 10 AD. You know what I mean? Like, and so we start to see how society was developing and things like that. And then, through all of this, the thing that shifts us into the place now, and remember, like we're in a blink in history. Like it's been centuries that colonialism has existed. But we're still in the blink of history, right? And so what we're experiencing is a blink in time where patriarchy does not have to exist. Like we can do away with that and it's going to be gone as it came. A part of that is being a part of a revolutionary anti-colonial process. Like you can't, like it requires you to get a revolutionary perspective, to look at all of the things that does not serve us, and being someone who is about making sure that we can live and be free and enjoy the fruits of our labor. But that can't happen if we aren't pulling all of us together so that we can forward that. And that's what matriarchy represents. Matriarchy represents, and for those of you who are joining now, what I was saying earlier is that matriarchy is not the domination of women over men. Matriarchy is more of an equality. It's about men and women making decisions in a society that requires both people to develop and serve the community, and because of that, a relationship and that working together, that society progresses. And patriarchy is not that. Patriarchy is about keeping that. It requires savagery, it requires violence, it requires all the things to move their society forward. And that's what we see with the out of Europe example, where Europe comes out of Europe, dirty, dusty Europe, killing each other Europe, and come out into the world and starts to wreak havoc on the rest of the world and deposit its mayhem and violence everywhere. So I just when we look at Diop, I want to look at more of his work, especially around this question of matriarchy and patriarchy, because we can find examples of matriarchy and patriarchy in the different cradles, in my view. What I believe he was saying is that throughout the entirety of these regions, the thing that emerges most often is when this idea of patriarchy or this idea of matriarchy. And I'm happy to be a part of the Southern Cradle. I'm happy to know that even within our family structures today, even if it is highly patriarchal, there is still this mama, this grandmama, this woman, this person, this woman who is highly esteemed, this person that holds the community together, that people revere. They love on their mama, and they might love on their daddy too, but it's usually like mamas are the thing. Aunties and sisters and things like that are more often than not seen as the glue to families and the holders of tradition and culture and the carrying forth of that. So we can see that very often within African communities and African households right now, which would also be another evidence-based thing to say that matriarchy, despite the imposition of patriarchy, has been something that we still hold center to our lives, right? Like I don't know, like I have a huge kind of family, you know what I mean? I am, and even within, if we explore even my family in the Caribbean, where daddies maybe, mamas yes, but daddies maybe, like mommies yes, but you know who your mama is, you might not know who your daddy is, sort of thing. You got a whole bunch of children, you got a whole family line because of daddy went out palanking and stuff. We still have women who held a family together, who made sure the children were together, and that people knew who they were, who their family was. And even though the names were lineage, the line was from your father, you knew that it was Tanti somebody, you know what I'm saying? If somebody aunt was Tanti somebody, stepmama or some next mama is Tanti somebody, everybody was cousin, or sister or brother. And that's also very curious too, because when we were looking at, when you're looking at, I'm using the Inuit a lot because I was digging deep into them, because that was a contradiction that I was seeing with the theory. But when you look at the family line for the Inuit, you just see mother, father, brother, sister, and cousin. And there's like no, so mother, brother will be an aunt to uncle. So it's like this idea of family in the most dynamic way. Like everything was a small set of family that was attached to another small set of family. So it was very, very like intimate. And when I was thinking about my family in particular, like this, the same sort of thing, that develops, is that everybody was tanti, auntie, cousin, things like that. You know what I mean? Uncle, even if they're your cousin, they're your uncle. It's just this idea of like this hierarchical a question of family and matriarchy. And so I'm happy to be from this other cradle. I'm happy to have experienced life as an African woman who was able to see the leadership of African women in my family, to see the leadership of African women in society. But I've also been alive under a system of colonialism that has perpetuated patriarchy, where we also see the importance of maleness raised more often than not. Growing up, talking about everybody was gay, and just this sort of demeaning way that we had grown up to see anybody who was effeminate or who didn't fit into this idea of maleness was something other than male, and that wasn't something that was appreciated within the society. And within matriarchy, like again, it doesn't have to you don't have to like contend with that. Like society is built on what society needs, and family and love and structure and tradition and culture are things that emerge and change and shift. And matriarchy is more conducive to that flexibility, where those changes and shifts are allowed to happen without criticism, contradictions, and so on and so forth. So once again, before I close out my discussion and open it up for Q&A, like patriarchy is yes, it's a thing, but it's not the thing, particularly for African people who have been colonized, and whose resources have been stolen and whose labor has been taken from us. Patriarchy is not innate to African people. I see that. And it's been deposited on us, but also because of colonialism. Colonialism is the spread of patriarchy out of the Northern Cradle, and the expansion of it throughout the colonized world. And again, and my final point there is that if we ever want to emerge as victorious against the forces of colonialism, we have to embrace matriarchy. We have to be anti-colonial. We have to break down and shift everything that these colonizers have done to strip us away from a progression to a place where we are now stuck doing all that they need us to do for them, but not accepting what we need to do for ourselves. And what we need to do for ourselves is shed the things that do not serve us. And obviously, the colonial mode of production does not serve us. And we need to be able to embrace African internationalism, African revolution, if we hope to get out of this place. Which is what we're doing with the African National Women's Organization. So I'm gonna stop here and allow Comrade Jay to come back on to give us some announcements. I'm gonna look through the chat, see if there's any questions or comments that I wanna address, and then we can keep moving. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you, President Yeshide. So we are on our way to the Q&A section, but make sure to prepare your questions and be ready. Remember to share your name and location and then your question, but first we're going to do some announcements. All right. We call on African women worldwide to join the African National Women's Organization, the only anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, revolutionary organization for Black women. We have members in Africa, Europe, Latin America, and all over the United States. ANWO is leading on everyday issues concerning African women. We are not just on the internet, we are on the ground in communities organizing for African liberation. Join the international collective of African women building the revolutionary capacity of African women. To learn more about membership and to join, visit anwo.org/join. So show material solidarity with the work of African National Women's Organization. We have big things planned next year, like beginning work on headquarters, organizing a flea and farmers market to support African economic development, events, and travel. We are an organization of the African poor and working class, so we need your support to make these projects happen. If you can't become a member, consider becoming a sustaining donor. With donation levels starting at $5 a month, start or renew your support today. We also accept one-time donations of any amount. Don't wait until the program ends. Start now. So you can donate at anwo.org/donate, or you can cash up Anwo Uhuru. Wear your politics with Anwo. Anwo's shop features t-shirts, sweatshirts, travel bags, mugs, hoodies, and even socks. Profits from the merch sales support the campaigns of Anwo, including Arrest CPS and Uhuru Kijiji Childcare's Collective. Become a decolonizer and support Anwo Economic Development Project. Decolonize hair and body. Decolonize hair and body are natural personal care products that highlight ingredients and traditional care practices used by Indigenous people around the world, in addition to featuring images and quotes of African revolutionary. And they are good. From butters and conditioners to oils, Decolonize has you covered from head to toe. Make your next purchase of skincare products from us at decolonize.com. And if you're in the DC metro area, purchase from us in person starting this month, January 2024. Hands off Uhuru, hands off Africa. Support the Uhuru 3 in our fight against the US indictments. Defend the African freedom struggle. Defend the African liberation struggle. Defend the Uhuru movement. To find out how you can support, go to handsoffuhuru.org. And if you enjoyed tonight's program and would like to help us produce shows in 2024, volunteer with us. ANWO is looking for producers, interpreters, chat moderators, and for future broadcasts, and for our convention as well. So email us at info@anwouhuru.org if you'd like to share your skills. And join ANWO members and the participating communities for the National Day of Action, with community discussions taking place in San Diego, August 26th, and in St. Louis, August 27th. Visit.
I think that's an old one.
I was like, August?
Yeah.
And all right. And okay, Harriet's Daughters Book Club and Study Group is a monthly virtual discussion that centers around African liberation related literature. For February, we'll be discussing In the Time of Butterflies by Julia Alvarez. Set during the waning days of the Trujillo dictatorship in the Dominican Republic in 1960, this tale of courage and sisterhood set in the Dominican Republic during the In the Time of Butterflies is inspired by the true story of the three Mirabal sisters who, in 1960, were murdered for their part in an underground plot to overthrow the government. You can register now at anwouhuru.org/events. And get ready to take a stand. ANWO calls on African women and our supporters worldwide to attend our annual Black Women's Convention. The 2024 theme is Taking a Stand Against Imperialism, Colonization, or Colonialism, and Neocolonialism. African women from every town, city, province, country, island, and village must attend this convention. The convention will be hybrid, online, and in person in St. Louis, Missouri. To find out more and to register, go to convention.anwouhuru.org. Don't wait. And hold on. It's not moving forward for some reason. All right. I think that is it for our announcements. Well, we have one more that's not going to be on the screen, but that's okay. It's coming June. Oh, no, sorry. I think that's it. So I guess we will go to Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Jay. Appreciate that. And I just want to double tap on the ANWO convention and that folks should go ahead and get registered. It's not just a convention for African women. It's going to be folks. We're going to have international women represented on the panels, discussions. And we want you to be a part of this discussion. This is us setting the terms for African women in the world and inviting other African women who are involved in the struggle against colonialism, imperialism, to be a part of this process of unifying and making it so that we have a unified force in developing a unified collective motion against imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism. So definitely go to convention.anwouhuru.org. Register is very affordable. Participate online. Come to St. Louis. We would love to have you. So I was looking through the chat and I didn't see a lot of questions. So if you got questions or comments even, start putting them in, your thoughts on patriarchy, your thoughts even on Cheikh Anta Diop or even colonialism. But I did see a few pinned and this seems like some weird backwards sort of comment. Not based on his other comments, but I didn't witness matriarchy in Africa when I was there in 1994 to 1996. I'm not sure what you witnessed, Black American homeland, which is a contradiction. Let's just say that. But I did talk about in the political education that African people have been colonized. And in 1994, 96, just like in 2023, 24, that colonialism has deeply rooted patriarchy within the process of within our society. And because of the process of colonialism, which robbed African people from developing for themselves or for ourselves, and also just developing for the oppressor, then this is what we are faced with today, a society that's not about forward motion, but a society that is trapped within this archaic backwards thing that doesn't progress society at all. So I'm not sure what part of Africa you were in or what you observed, but the thing is that, you know, we're under patriarchal system right now everywhere. There's no matriarchy anywhere. You know what I mean? As widespread as it may seem, they may be in smaller communities and such, so things and so forth. But you know, I was even in Sierra Leone, and it shook me a little bit. I didn't realize how much I had this idea around maleness and how men are supposed to act with one another. But and this is not all Sierra Leoneans, but we were in Freetown, and you know, we were at this outdoor parties, adult men who were hugging, kissing one another. Not in like a sexual way, but these are friends, these are brothers, these are people who socialize, just like having fun, dancing with one another, and like and there was like no shame in that. Like you would like not like, you know how they do the reggae dances, we just don't like. It was like dancing. It was like, you know, things that could have been seen as sexually or yeah, like it would have challenged their maleness to be seen like that in a club in New York City, for example. You know what I mean? And in this society, it wasn't like that, even though the patriarchy is still a dominant piece of work in Sierra Leone. But in terms of like interactions with men and women, and even amongst men, it was very shocking to see this sort of relationship that men were having with one another as friends, as countrymen, as people. And again, this is not something that's pervasive through all parts of Sierra Leone, I'm sure. but it was really refreshing to see that kind of relationship with one another. And there was what was something else, but I was just responding to Black American Homeland, who also said that matriarchy was the fall of Africa. Oh gosh, I'm not going to. I pin that, but I also think that it's ridiculous to think that matriarchy was the fall of Africa. And I think this is probably a white person. This has to be. This has to be a European colonizer. And if you're not a European colonizer, you have absorbed the European colonizer in yourself to say that matriarchy was the fall of Africa, and that when in fact it was colonialism that was the I don't even think Africa fell. I think Africa was conquered. And just like anything, any place that has been conquered, it can be unconquered. And we have a responsibility as African people to destroy the systems of oppression that continue to keep us oppressed. And matriarchy is not the thing that keeps us oppressed right now. The matriarchy isn't the thing that is stealing the resources out of our land. That's not why Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso are saying French out of Africa. This is matriarchy is not the basis for that. Matriarchy is not stopping African men. Was it Nigeria? I think that's Nigeria, preventing them from letting African women play a role in the decision-making bodies of that country. I mean, it's really matriarchy in doing that. And the fall of Africa, or the conquering of Africa, was a result of a savage, dominating northern cradle people who have come into a place that was not as savage as it was, and taking from it what it required to be self-sufficient and self-determined, and making everything about its producing for the oppressed as opposed to the people who are now being oppressed. So, for me, like this comment is ridiculous, and I think that he must be a white left. I mean, a white left or right person right now, who is the instigator on this account. So, other comment was from High Frequency Beauty, Coco, who couldn't be on with us today. We had some technical issues. And I was saying something, and she was saying, this is how you know patriarchy is not innate. We love, revere, and respect our mothers, grandmothers, aunties, and sisters in general. And I would say that as well. I was in a room with some feminists. I know it was a weird time for me. And it was a heavy feminist, and she's a popular feminist, and she was saying that your brother probably beats up. We were talking about family relationships, and I told her that my brothers are very, good to women, and that they have very beautiful relationships with their daughters and their wives. I said, you don't know that. You don't know that they could be over there beating up their wives and stuff. I'm like, what are you talking about? And why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because even when there's evidence, loads of evidence that we are a community, whether you're from the Caribbean, Africa, somewhere else in the world, in Europe or whatever, you'll see the family dynamics. Even if there is a male patriarch in the family is usually held together, loved and revered, probably by the patriarch too. But more often than not, the woman, this mother, this figure is the center of the family. And that doesn't mean that the man does not have a responsibility or is not also cared for and loved, but it could be just different. And even those patriarchs revere the woman that's the center of the family. Somebody, mama, auntie, uncle, but auntie, uncle, because that's also, what's the one where there's a woman who's very masculine, they call her, I forget, it's like a little combination of a word. Anyway, so auntie, uncle, or uncle, auntie, somebody that's in that community is holding together. And I will also correlate that to even Vogue culture and house culture too, where African men who are gay, who are needing family because they have been cast out by their family, now have like house mothers, like they like devote, like there's mothers who are men who bring together this community of of people who have been outcast by their family and bring them together in houses and build a family that is not innate. And even that, even though they are men, right, they still have this name like house mother. I'm the mother of the family, because that's essentially, because that's an African thing, like the Vogue and house, like that's African people who have come together to do that. And that also the idea of the holding together is like the mother piece. So that's what I wanted to say. And I didn't see any additional comments after that. Oh, I closed it. Hold on a second. But I would also just tap on just continue. I just want to big up to Unemployed Scholar, Don Hammonds, Black No Capso, Mumbizi Jumbio. I'm also thankful that you hung in there with this discussion. And even Black American Homeland, whatever you contributed, it was something, right? And all the other people who are watching who might not have chatted, so I don't see your names. But I really appreciate you. And Comrade Mecca, who also came in. And just really appreciate you all for watching and sharing the live streams that we're doing. And I definitely wanted to open the year with the question of patriarchy, because when we're in spaces, people tend to wrap patriarchy like, yeah, we got to get rid of patriarchy, colonialism, imperialism, and they kind of mention all of these things like this, like a bag of tricks. And this thing is like one of the things that's equitable with everything else. And for African women, it's not like patriarchy exists in our world, but it's not the thing. And it's really important for us as an African women's organization to be able to define how we understand patriarchy, how it plays out in the world, and also how it plays out in the lives of African women. And there's a lot of instances of that are being brought up as the basis for why we have to prioritize patriarchy. So, for example, a lot of gender-based violence that we can see, imperialist-driven gender-based violence, social, just regular, everyday gender-based violence, for no reason whatsoever. There's men who feel slighted by women and throw acid in their face. There are men who experience some sort of assault in the world and come home and decide that they want to carry out that assault in the household with their wives, mothers, brothers, families, children, and the same for some women as well. So we acknowledge that these are very real instances where that call people to prioritize patriarchy over everything else. But when we look at colonialism and the development of violence within colonized communities, I'm so thankful for Frantz Fanon for writing the chapter on violence in Wretched of the Earth, which explains that within colonized communities, the levels of violence increases, right? Yeah, oppressor nation communities also experience violence, but we see an elevated level of violence within colonized communities. So there's killings of each other, of opposite genders, children. It's just heightened because the level of oppression is so deep, and you're in these ghettos or you're in these trapped communities, and you're just seeing somebody who looks like you, who you can't stand because you're also trapped like them, and the level of that's some old psychobabble stuff that that Fanon is talking about, but it rings true where you see yourself and the thing that's in front of you is most immediate, which is another Black man, another Black woman, your family, et cetera. And these are the things that become the target of your aggression. So even as we look at elevated levels of violence again that is gender-based. So for example, we see mass rapes in the Sudan, and we see raping and murder of women all over the world, and in particular colonized places. And we see all these things that would indicate to us that patriarchy is running wild out here in these worlds. I would imagine, right, that if you were involved in the process of getting free from colonial domination, that the levels of these violence towards one another would decrease. I mean, one of the fantastic things that came out of the organizing around Mike Brown's killing is that, and in St. Louis in particular, one of the things that were documented was that the gangs stopped fighting each other for a time, and they were directing their guns, the animosity, the anger toward the oppressor. And that's what Fanon reasons too in his book. And I'm sure that Fanon and Diop had crossed paths because they were around the same time as each other. And they were both from the French colonies, and they both spoke French. But he reasons that that in the times when you're fighting the oppressor, the levels of violence that are committed against one another decreases. And so I would reason as well that in the process of getting free from colonial domination and dealing with the challenges of gender-based violence, that if you're concerned with getting free from the oppressor, you ain't got time to go slap on somebody's woman. You know what I mean? I mean, unless she the oppressor woman, you know what I mean? Unless she Jenny from the, she Jenny and she trying to stop you from getting free, you might want to slap on her. And in which case, that's anti-colonial violence and resistance. You know what I mean? It's not gender-based violence in that case. You're an oppressed person trying to get free from the oppressor. That's the kind of anti-colonial struggle that we're seeing. So patriarchy is a process of patriarchy decreases as we accomplish our goal of forwarding society by dealing with the colonial mode of production that keeps the entire society oppressed, that keeps us trapped in these same old backward situations, that doesn't allow us to develop and be free and observe and be flexible with the world, that keeps us very stiff and rigid, keeps us rigid to gender, keeps us rigid to ideas of maleness and femaleness, and it doesn't adapt to what the world needs us to be, which is to be free peoples and human beings that can, create, produce, and reproduce for ourselves. And I appreciate the examinations that I've seen in all the works that I've done throughout some of these studies, like Diop's work, Sankara. I appreciate Sankara too, because, here is this leader who was what people call him a feminist, but he was a revolutionary. His ideas around women and trying to allow for women in Burkina Faso to emerge as leaders was seeing some of the challenges and struggles that women and girls were experiencing under direct colonialism, and also know that the society can't progress without women being active shapers of that society. So you create these conditions, you give them as much confidence and create opportunities for women to emerge as leaders, because that society needs women to emerge as leaders. We can't be trapped by the same patriarchal colonial system that has trapped us for so long. And so the reason why I appreciate Sankara is we spend a lot of time in ensuring that the women of Burkina Faso and even wrote pieces. One of his speeches at Women's Day was made into a book that I've used on one of my programs. And it's really, I just really appreciate it when we see that from African men, because there's this idea that African men don't want to let go of this patriarchy, right? Like they want to hold on to it, and it was gifted to them. They were knighted by the colonizers to be patriarchs, and they want to hold on to it. But any progressive man, or any man who sees that this is not benefiting society or even himself, even holding on to these ideas of maleness, he wants to get rid of it. And I'm here for it. And we want to encourage men to get rid of that and join the African Revolution. We want to encourage women to get rid of all of the things that have kept us from being empowered leaders, participants in the African Revolution, and calling you once again before we close the program to come to the African Women's Convention and participate in this discussions around imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism. Even if you're not up on the subject, just come through, you know what I'm saying, and hear what folks are saying and be engaged, because you never know. Like, there's a lot of things that happen in our lives that people's like, oh, it's this and it's that. I'm like, it's colonialism. Reason why you ain't got childcare, colonialism. The reason why, your husband beats on you, colonialism. Ain't, just saying this colonialism ain't gonna solve the husband beating on your problem, but some other stuff that we can do as revolutionaries to deal with that problem. But it's, the things that we're experiencing within a society that's held and trapped within the colonial mode of production is colonialism. And part and parcel of what we have to do, what we must do, is to struggle against that, fight against that, and come together about it. Yes, I do. Yeah, okay, great. Cool. Don Hammond says, what is the correct and African internationalist response and interpretation to the hate that content creators such as Umar Johnson and Talcum X, Sean King, or Chris Charleston White? I'm not familiar with Talcum X. Is it this? I mean, you put it in the same as Sean. I'm not familiar with them. And okay, Sean King. Okay, and Charleston White. I am familiar with Umar. I am surprised, but I mean, I think the African internationalist response would be because I don't watch Umar Johnson, but I do get clips sometimes of things that he says, which I'm very shocked that women follow him. But the correct response is to, I think, educate him and his followers around the fact that patriarchal modes of thought are oppressive. Okay. Yeah, patriarchal modes of thought are oppressive, and that that don't for society, and that what they're perpetuating is the colonizer in your household, in your relationships. I mean, that's the way that I would approach it. Sean King beefing with the mother of a victim of police assassination. I think that's a something that, oh yeah, Tamir Rice mom. Okay, got it. Tamir Rice's mother, when Tamir Rice was murdered, we were involved with her for a short period of time, and she's a very vocal and very, like, she knows what she wants to say when she gonna say it. You know what I mean? And I think part of any argument that Sean King would have is pretty much control. There's a way that mothers of police shooting victims are wrangled by the petty bourgeoisie. That's another element of it too. And they are told to follow this sort of formula around how you portray yourself and what you say, how you, how you portray yourself. And when you don't fall into that line, when you say fuck the police, sorry, when you say F this, F that, I'm going to come for this or whatever, like, that is seen as coming out of pocket. You are not in line with some of the mothers who are also victims. And I think that's a method of control. And it's a method of control that is a part of the patriarchy, like, and it's an expectation too, that also that women are supposed to behave in a certain kind of way too, outside of just the question of being a survivor of a child that was killed by the police. There's expectation that women are supposed to portray themselves as kind, loving, spread peace. And we also gone through a PE that said that women have not, that's not the way that African women who have been fighting the oppressor have ever been. We've always been fighters and healers in the way that we fight too. And I think that could be one of the situations as well. So it's a control and power issue. It's about telling this African mother who experienced a child being killed that this is not the behavior that you should exhibit when you're talking about this issue. And I'm not familiar Yeah, yes, it is. I agree. The desire for control is a symptom of colonialism. And I'm not familiar with the argument, so I will have to say that. But I do know Tamir Rice's mom in terms of like her power and how she talks about her situation and her son is very powerful. And she ain't gonna be controlled by nobody. She just like, ah. And I do think that if he's beefing with her, it'll probably be because she not laying down, allowing him or anybody else to tell her how she should talk about her situation. So thank you so much for the question. I appreciate that. And I'm going to look up some of these struggles too that are happening in real time and educate myself. So I just want to thank everybody once again for coming to the live African Women Must Lead. And I appreciate everybody who watches us on the repeat. And thank you so much. I really appreciate you. Stay tuned. We do not have a breakdown. We were going to have the breakdown this weekend, but we couldn't have it this weekend. So stay tuned for the breakdown next month. And another African Women Must Lead next month as well. So who everyone, have a safe evening, and we will see you next time. Uhuru.